Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my standard shorter length review of the Sony FE 50mm F1.2 G Master lens. The G Master series has really taken off, and when I first started to do Sony reviews, I reviewed some of the earlier G Master lenses, and I came away with some mixed feelings in that they were very good lenses, but they weren't necessarily exceptional lenses. And the way that they were marketed, they should be exceptional lenses. But as time has passed, Sony has really hit its stride, and starting with about the 24mm f1.4 G Master and the 135mm f1.8, then the 35mm f1.4 and 14mm f1.8. These have been exceptional lenses that are amongst the very best in their class or type. The same, of course, is going to be true here of the 50mm f1.2, which, by the way, sets to rest all of those rumors that were going around the internet that the limitations of the Sony E-mount would prevent it from ever seeing lenses like a 50mm f1.2 that we would never see on Sony, the kind of lenses we can see on Canon RF or Nikon Z. Clearly not the case, as the 50mm f1.2 G Master is one of the very best lenses of its kind, and in many ways is an upgrade to the previous Sony Zeiss 50mm f1.4 planar lens, a lens that I already felt was amongst the very best autofocusing 50mm lenses that I had ever tested, so I ended up buying one for myself. And yes, I will do a few comparisons to that lens in this review today, but I also have a secondary episode that you can check out where I do a real direct comparison and just focus on the differences and similarities between the two lenses. So I recommend that you check that out when it arrives, probably next week. And if you want a more thorough review of that, you can check out my definitive review instead. And also be sure to check out our new channel that Craig and I have launched, Let the Light In TV. And you can find a link to that in the description down below. The 50mm f1.2 G Master follows the typical G Master formula when it comes to the build and the handling of the lens. Like all of these lenses, it is a thoroughly weather-sealed, professional-grade build. In this case, we have 10 different seal points, starting with a gasket at the rear of the lens. We have internal seals throughout at the switches and the rings, and then we have a flooring coating on the front element. And so you have a thorough degree of weather sealing that I think probably surpasses what we saw on the planar, as while I know that there is a very thin gasket on that and that Sony does claim that it is weather and dust sealed, I never have seen a diagram or been able to find a diagram of the internals on it, which tells me that maybe Sony's a little bit more confident on the degree of weather sealing in this particular lens. There is also the G Master approach to aperture. And so we have three different options basically to how to control the aperture. You can put it in an automatic mode and just control from within the camera, or allow the camera to control. You can go into a manual aperture ring and you can choose in 1/3 stop detents. I will note that I found the detents a little strong for my taste. It's quite clicky when you rotate it, and so I feel like it's a little bit rougher in that sense than what some of the other G Master lenses have been, almost too clearly defined detents. But you also have the option to declick the aperture if you don't like that, or if you want to do aperture racking for video. And so you've got lots of flexibility on how you're going to handle that. Now, ironically, the other ring is a little bit too loose for my taste. The manual focus ring, it moves very smoothly and you can get precision there, but the damping is a little on the light side, and I would actually prefer a little bit more damping, as that just allows you to have a little bit more of a true manual focus kind of feel and a little bit more precision there. And so ironically, I would kind of like to reverse the two rings, and that I would like a little less tension on the aperture ring and a little bit more on the manual focus ring. Same time, I do recognize that most of the time, very few people are going to be using the manual focus ring all that often, as this, as we'll see in a moment, is a very good autofocusing lens. Beyond that, as far as features, you have focus hold button. In fact, it's in two positions here, and so you can easily access whether you're shooting in horizontal or in portrait orientations. And you have an AF/MF switch, and that's always a welcome addition. And in this case, there's also an upgrade relative to the planar when it comes to the lens hood. It's a little bit shallower, and it's because, as we're going to see, the flare resistance is already really great on this lens natively. But the things that I really do like above all is that it has a kind of rubberized ring up at the front. And that's just a really handy thing if you bump against something, but also, as many people like to do, it allows you to, place a lens with the lens hood down, and it gives you a nice, kind of stable place where you're not worrying about damaging the lens to set it down. So highly appreciated there. Interestingly, the size has not really changed relative to the planar lens. It's not to say that this is a small lens, but at 108 millimeters in length, it is, relatively short, and I think it comes in at about 78 millimeters in diameter. And so it's the same length and just a little bit wider in diameter than what the planar lens was. And it shares the same 72 millimeter front filter thread. But I think the upside here is that you're getting a larger maximum aperture and, a little bit, I think, more thorough weather sealing. And in fact, rather than gaining weight, you're actually dropping just a couple of grams. It's basically the same thing, but the planar was 780 grams, whereas the new G Master is 778 grams. So I think that's pretty impressive, particularly when you compare it to the equivalent lenses on Canon RF or Nikon Z or Z mount. And particularly when it comes to the Nikon lens, that Nikon lens is 150 millimeters long, 42 millimeters longer, and it weighs in at well over a kilogram. It's about 300 grams heavier than what this lens is. And the Canon lens is larger in diameter, same length, but it also is considerably heavier, though not as much as what the Nikon lens is. So relative to the competition, and I think to the predecessor of this lens, Sony has done a good job of, giving us a little bit more lens, but without a whole lot more bulk. And I always appreciate that. Inside you have 11 rounded aperture blades, and I noted when I did my kind of testing of the bokeh just in terms of the geometry, there's a mild amount of geometric deformation at f1.2, but you stop down to something like f2 and you have consistently round bokeh circles, bokeh balls all around the frame, and so that's going to certainly be handy. And as you stop on down, that higher aperture blade count does do a good job of keeping a circular looking shape. Now, when it comes to the autofocus here, it used to be that you had to essentially choose when you were, choosing a large aperture lens. If you chose the smaller aperture, a lot of times like an f1.8 lens, you tended to get faster, quieter autofocus. But basically the idea was, as you move to those big heavy elements, there's going to be a trade-off in autofocus. Autofocus speed is going to be slower. It's going to be a little bit more clunky in operation. And that was one of my chief criticisms, for example, with the earlier 85mm f1.4 G Master, in that the autofocus performance wasn't nearly as good as the 85mm f1.8 lens from Sony. Fortunately, Sony has really figured out how to handle that problem in the G Master series. About the time I think that they got a little bit more exceptional in their performance. So basically they calculate the amount of torque needed to move the lens elements, and they assign a specific number of XD linear focus motors to achieve focus. In some cases where it's, a less demanding application, you can get away with one. More often I've seen dual linear focus motors, and in a couple of occasions like this one, there are quad linear motors. And so two focusing motors on either side of the focusing group that allow it to move really fast back and forth. And so like the 135mm f1.8, this f1.2 50mm lens has that quad application. So the byproduct is, even though you've got these huge glass elements in here, autofocus is snappy, it is very quiet and smooth in operation. In fact, if we do my focus pull test that I like to do, there's basically no noise. It's playing here in the background, but you can't hear any noise because there's no noise to hear. Autofocus is very silent in operation in that application. Also, you can see that focus pulls are confident and they're smooth, no problem there. And if I do something like approaching the camera, you can see that it does autofocus tracking of my eye very well. In fact, right now I'm filming at 50mm f1.2 mounted on my Sony Alpha 1 to give you a sense of how it does for, this kind of static shot where it's tracking my face and, as I move around and gesture, as I tend to do. We also, Craig and I, used it in some various other video applications, including he used it on a slider as a part of the Mozza SliPod Pro review that will be coming to the Let the Light In TV channel here this week. And as a part of that, he used the 50mm, not planar, but 50mm G Master a fair bit on that. And we got nice, stable autofocus performance. The only time that it wasn't stable is if we got a little bit too close and you push up against that minimum focus distance. So you get a little bit of pulsing, not really the lens's fault, it's because you're trying to get it to focus closer than what it's capable of doing. And on that note, you are able to get closer than you were with the planar lens, and you get a nice magnification figure here of 0.17 times, which is on the high side for a 50mm lens and tops what we saw on the planar at 0.15 times. So that's always welcome because I love to get close to things and throw backgrounds really out of focus, which you can really do with an f1.2 lens. So it just adds to the versatility of the lens for either photo or video use. Overall, however, I saw really good accuracy, and when I used it in a portrait session, of course, IEF was flawless. I shot primarily at 50mm f1.2, and I got really well focused results as a part of that. The only time I really saw missed focus was when I'd kind of hidden my subject behind a birch tree, and something about that white bark threw it off just a little bit for one shot. Very minor, but overall my autofocus accuracy was excellent with the lens. That same excellence applies to the image quality. Now, if you want a deeper breakdown of that, check out the definitive review, but essentially as it applies to the planar was already an exceptionally good lens optically. And essentially what I've seen is that you're getting pretty much the same performance at f1.2 as you did with that lens at f1.4, and that it's sharp all across the frame. I noticed a few minor advantages at different points on the frame for the G Master lens. One of the main things that I saw is that the difference in aperture size is only 1/3 stop. But I always found that the planar lens, it wasn't the brightest f1.4 lens. And that showed up in these tests here, in that rather than getting 1/3 stop variance in my test, I actually saw 2/3 stop. So that's going to be a significant difference in this lens. It also is going to trade off in not just more light gathering, but better autofocus in low light situations. And these shots, for example, of Loki, I shot at f1.2 in pretty close, a nearly dark room. And you can see the shots actually look pretty good, but more importantly, autofocus is nailed even in that dim environment. And that is helped by having a brighter glass that lets in more light for autofocus. So that was the significant difference that I saw. I did note a little bit of improved contrast relative to the planar lens. But I mean, both of these lenses are exceptionally good optically. And as you begin to stop down the G Master, it gets just sharper and higher contrast still up through about f4, where you hit your kind of limitation. And anything beyond that, it's more about getting more depth of field. The lens is already exceptionally sharp. But for example, in this shot here, if you compare even at a landscape distance of f1.2 versus f5.6, depth of field is different. Obviously, there's more in focus with f5.6. But really, f1.2 on the area of shared focus is just as sharp as f5.6. That's pretty impressive if you, when you're looking at it at that perspective. There was a little bit of pincushion distortion that I saw, and also a moderately heavy amount of vignette, about 3 stops in the extreme corners. Par for the course typically for large aperture lenses, but of course, being a first-party lens, you get full profile support. Probably not going to be a real-world problem for you because it'll be fixed in camera for JPEGs and video. And of course, at this stage, there are profiles and probably most all editing software because this is a high-profile lens to correct for that. So probably not a big deal. Aberrations are very well controlled. I saw very minimal longitudinal chromatic aberrations. I didn't really see any lateral chromatic aberrations. So very strong performance there. And then also, as noted, flare resistance is exceptionally good with this lens. That's typically a weak point for for any kind of f1.2 very large maximum aperture lens. But in this case, it really wasn't. And Sony's coatings are really some of the very best in the business. As you can see, even panning against the sun at wide open f1.2, it's letting in so much light that the image is a little bit washed out, but you don't see any ghosting there. And if we stop down to where we're getting the proper shutter speed, at f11, I am seeing great contrast, and really no additional ghosting artifacts. So really impressive. And in my, my real world shots, for example, in these portrait series, I was very strongly backlighting my subject and then front lighting them with flashing, strobing, and I never saw any issue with flare. And so this is going to be a really flexible portrait tool. And in general, because it has great sharpness along with beautiful bokeh, this is going to be a dream for portrait photographers. It just really does an amazing job and allows you to shoot at f1.2, do full body shots, still have a shallow depth of field there, and just obviously flexibility on how you want to approach a shoot. And so I suspect it will become a favorite tool for a lot of wedding and portrait photographers, particularly those that favor the 50mm focal length. At the end of the day, the final hurdle to overcome is the price. It's about $2,000 US. And obviously that's going to be expensive no matter how you slice it. If you want to make yourself feel better, it is cheaper than the alternatives from either Canon or Nikon. You're getting, just as much lens, actually a little bit less lens because it's a little bit smaller and lighter, good thing. But optically and in performance-wise, you're getting just as much lens, if not more, and at a slightly lower price. So that's if you're trying to sell yourself or a significant other on why you need to buy the lens, there's your ammunition. The reality, though, is this is about a $500 increase over the planar lens, which at the moment is retailing for $1,500 US. We'll see if there is a drop in price on that lens, due to the G Master being on the market. And so that could be still a decent alternative to you. But if you want the very best, I think that Sony is doing what the G Master series should do, and it's giving you a clearly defined top shelf option. It may be too expensive for you, and that's perfectly fine. But at the same time, if you do want the absolute best, I can now say with confidence that the Sony FE 50mm f1.2 G Master lens is exactly that at a 50mm focal length. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to the full text review on my website. You can also find an image gallery there if you want to look at more photos. Beyond that, there are some buying links if you would like to purchase one for yourself. There's also linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, linkage to buy some of my merchandise. There's also linkage there where you can sign up for my newsletter or become a patron. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube and be sure to ring the bell to get notifications when new content drops. Check out Let the Light In TV as well and subscribe over there to get even more content. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day. And let the light in.